Another example, indirect preservation here. The brain is gone, but the brain was inside the skull. We can get what's called an endocast, which is, it's not quite a model of the brain, it's a model of the brain cavity. In some animals, the brain fills the brain cavity. That wasn't the case here, but we can actually sort of reconstruct what soft tissues were in there. We can saw it in half like Henry Fairfield Osborn did to this one, and then make a plaster mold, or we can take a skull and CT scan it, which is what we did with Sue, and reconstruct the tissues that way. Either way, we get a pretty good idea of what's going on in the brain, or at least parts of the brain. And then combine that with phylogenetic information. This is not cooperating. There we go. And this is from a paper that another friend of mine named Hans Larsen and others published several years ago. We know what the brain of a bird is like. We can just cut one open. Okay. We know what the brain of a croc is like. Again, cut one open. We can reconstruct the endocast of several different theropod dinosaurs related to birds, and we can say something about how the brain was organized in T. rex relative to a modern bird or to some other kind of extinct theropod, which lets us say a lot more about the evolution of the central nervous system in these animals. Okay, so again, we're combining indirect preservation with phylogenetic information to say more than we could say with just one or the other by themselves. And then we can even make predictions about things that aren't even indirectly preserved. They are gone, completely gone, kaput, goodbye, to dust and ashes. What about the heart? Hearts have never been found in any Mesozoic dinosaur, as far as I know. One was reported, but that got debunked pretty quick. Most living reptiles, most snakes, lizards, and turtles, have a three-chambered heart. So the blood comes in from the body after it's delivered its oxygen, comes into this atrium. It gets pumped into a ventricle here. Ventricle then pushes it to the lungs where it picks up oxygen, back to the heart here, into this atrium, pumped into the ventricle, and then sent to the body. The problem is there's only one ventricle, which means blood coming in from the body that's gotten rid of its oxygen, or at least some of its oxygen, is mixing with blood that's just come back from the lungs to get oxygen. And some of the blood that's being sent to the body has just come back from there. Some of the blood that's being sent to the lungs has just come back from there. It works. Many thousands of species do this, but it's not very efficient. A four-chambered heart, which is what we have, but also so do crocodilians and birds. They both have a four-chambered heart. Develops differently from ours, but it's a four-chambered heart. Separates the ventricles here. So blood coming in from the body that's oxygen depleted is sent only to the lungs. Blood that's coming in from the lungs is sent only to the rest of the body. Separates them, it's much more efficient gas exchange. Okay? Which kind of heart did T. rex have? I mean, we can sort of make all kinds of suppositions based on whether it was warm or cold-blooded, but we can be more precise than that. Let's take a look at the evolutionary relationships. Birds have a four-chambered heart. Lizards, and that's the back end of a turtle, lizards and turtles, three-chambered hearts. Crocodilians, it's four-chambered. Actually, it's an optional four-chambered heart. Crocodilians have a special shunt between the aortae up here so that when they're submerged, they can redirect blood that's supposed to go to the lungs back to the body. I mean, blood that's coming back from the body still has some oxygen in it, just not as much as it came back from the lungs. And they can live on that while they're submerged for quite a long time, which is why you sometimes walk on a crocodilian and it's asleep underwater. And you're kind of worried that it's died, and it's just sacked out. It's living on this. So anyway, they can do that. Wish I could. A lot of things I wish I could do. I didn't evolve with a long tongue like a chameleon. Tyrannosaurs here are related to birds and crocodilians. We would again assume that the last common ancestor of birds and crocs had a four-chambered heart, not a three-chambered one, passed it on to its descendants, and that T. rex inherited that four-chambered heart. Now, do we know that it had a four-chambered heart? No. But that's our default prediction. And this method has shown to be fairly robust. Not perfect. The same method would put a full coat of fur on a whale, but nevertheless, it does seem to work for the most part. Some things we'll probably never be able to tell, like what color were they? Now, there was a paper published earlier this year arguing that some small dinosaurs seem to have orange or reddish stripes along their tail. That's based on a small animal from a small fossil from China called Sinosauropteryx. They seem to find microscopic structures preserved around them that might have been the pigment-bearing bodies. That's never been found for T-Rex, so we just don't know. And I would argue that that's not something we're going to regularly be able to predict. That's a very unusual case right there. But some things we'll just never know. I mean, was it purple? I can't say it wasn't. I think it looks goofy that way, but, you know, who am I to say? But there are other things we can say. For example, I mean, we don't know what color it was, but what texture did it have? Okay? And here we have to, again, look at evolutionary relationships. Here are tyrannosaurs, birds, dromaeosaurids. These are like the velociraptors in Jurassic Park, other theropods, the plant-eating dinosaurs, crocs up there. If we look at ornithischians, for the most part, they appear to have not had feathers. They appear to have had scaly skin like this. Now, some of them might have actually had some sort of quills along their back, apparently, but in terms of the flanks, in terms of most of the body, they had scaly skin. Sauropods, the long-necked dinosaurs, same thing. Crocodilians generally do not have feathers. Okay, again, scaly skin, just like these two. But we know that birds have feathers. Somewhere between the last common ancestor of crocs and birds and the last common ancestor of living birds and some of their extinct relatives, feathers arose. And until about 20 years ago or 10 years ago, we didn't actually know where on this line feathers arose. We couldn't say. So did dromaeosaurids have feathers? Did compsognathids have feathers? We didn't know. We were pretty sure that there's skin impressions from some early theropods, from sauropods, and these ornithischians. Pretty sure we can say no, at least in terms of overall body texture, that they didn't. But somewhere along this line, feathers arose, and we couldn't say where. So maybe they had plumage, maybe they didn't. We couldn't say. Then Sinosauropteryx was found. This is the one that it was involved in that paper earlier this year that seemed to suggest orange stripes. And if you look at the textures, it does seem to have kind of a blocked pattern. But this thing has what looks like what's been called dino fuzz. Okay, it has some sort of these little hollow, probably keratinous, although they're not keratinous anymore, fibers going along the back, and they probably covered the whole body. And these, we believe, are the precursors of feathers. So we have a small feathered theropod, and this is a compsognathid. This is a little dinosaur that's a little bit further down the tree than tyrannosaurs. And then more recently, we've actually got dromaeosaurids. This is Microraptor. It's a small velociraptor relative. And this thing doesn't just have fuzz, it has feathers. It has honest-to-God feathers. You can see it's got the barbs, those little fibers that come off from the rachis, which is the central axis. It had long feathers coming off of the arms and the legs, as it turns out. So we've actually now got good evidence for feathers on compsognathids, or at least things that we think gave rise to feathers, and in dromaeosaurids. What about tyrannosaurs? Now, I have seen reports of skin impressions of T-Rex that don't show feathers. I haven't actually seen the fossils themselves, but our default prediction is that they were feathered animals. Could that have changed? Could they have lost the feathers? Yes. But our default prediction is that the feathers were there. Now, this fossil here, this is a cool fossil. I had a chance to look at this a few years ago. It's from China. This one fulfilled 4 different predictions at once. Okay, it's Dilong paradoxus. It's an early Cretaceous. It's about 125 million years old. It's a small relative of T-Rex. It's a tyrannosauroid, but it's a fairly old one. Here's the skull. The skull's about like that. Okay. Up until the discovery of Dilong, what we had were tyrannosaurs. Let me move ahead here. What we had were animals like this, tyrannosaurs, known only from basically the end of the age of dinosaurs. They first appeared 90 to 100 million years ago, and they croak at 65. But we have all these other groups, birds, dromaeosaurids, and these other groups that appear earlier in the fossil record. Now, logically, if these are descended from the same last common ancestor as these, then this lineage, too, must go back in time. That's called a ghost lineage. So we can also predict when fossils will be found. T-Rex is big. These other ones are small. We would predict that the ancestral condition here is to be small. T-Rex has basically a two-fingered hand. It actually has a remnant of the third. It's just the metacarpal. But basically, they have thumb and index finger, and that's it. Okay? All the rest of these have three-fingered hands. We would predict a three-fingered hand down here. And all of these have feathers. So we would predict, even though we have late Cretaceous, gigantic two-fingered animals of unknown pelage, it's possible that they came from animals that were older, smaller, fluffy, and three-fingered. And Dilong was all three. Okay? It did have, I don't have a good picture of the actual fossil, but it did have a third finger. I wouldn't call it tiny, but it's certainly a lot smaller than T-Rex. And it did have feathers, or at least feather precursors. They've got them carbonized around the outside of the body. So in one fossil, 4 predictions fulfilled with one blow. And since then, they've actually found some probable tyrannosaurs that are older still in the late Jurassic, which is where they should be. But again, we were able to make a bunch of predictions. So we can say quite a lot about this fossil, even if we don't have it all preserved, if we can say something about its evolutionary relationships. Very powerful tool for going beyond just the fossils themselves. Okay? Some things we'll probably never be able to tell. The media like to portray some debates, some things as debates that aren't. For example, was T-Rex a predator or a scavenger? The answer is almost certainly yes. Okay? Really, it's not a debate. I mean, most of us would think that, A, it's fundamentally not testable, and even if it was, very few animals today will only eat things that are alive or only eat things that are dead. People like to think that cats are these pure predators. A cat of 9 lives hardly counts as live prey. And I've got several pet snakes that none of them has ever had live prey. Snakes will scavenge. But was it a predator or a scavenger? That's the kind of thing we'd have a hard time telling. Okay, so some things we'll never know. What kind of sound did they make? Did they quack? Did they roar? Did they chirp? I don't know. What color were they? Some things are still left to speculation. Some things we simply can't answer. But I submit that by knowing something about its evolutionary heritage, we can say more than we could have otherwise. And using the very same methods we would use to reconstruct the internal organs of a 65-million-year-old corpse, we can also make predictions about where viruses come from, about what kinds of preventive methods we want to apply, about when infectious diseases arose. We can make all kinds of useful predictions basically using the same techniques. So it can be a thought experiment, or it can be something that actually saves lives. It can be both. And for that, we've got Dr. Darwin here to thank. And I thank you for your time.